just a good way to get into this guy's good graces so he could sell him some spurious gold powder and some spurious manuscripts. But Kelly got tricked. And on Easter Monday, 1582, when the angels came back and said, "Can you read it yet?" And Kelly said, "No, I didn't learn it." The angels squeezed him. And Dee records that Kelly was in excruciating pain for about 20 minutes. And when he came out of his pain trance, he could read it. Now, this gives us the clue that the language itself is being extruded, is being produced by the DNA. So once Kelly could read the language, then the angels began transmitting, first of all, a series of sort of practice runs that sort of like what we call in the South speaking in tongues. It's sort of nonsense syllables. But as those nonsense syllables built up, it eventually became a language. Now we know of over 7,000 languages, of which only a handful are man-made. And those man-made languages are usually experiments or they're technical languages. But in all the 7,000 languages and all the dozen or so made-up languages, there's not one that is real, that has a grammar and a syntax that can be translated. They're all artificial. Enochian is a real language. And the curious thing is, the calls or the invocations in this language were given early on, and years passed before the angels got around to translating them. But when the angels did translate them, it turns out that it was a very coherent language. It was a language that you can, in fact, use to create other statements. Once you understand the grammar, you can actually make up your own calls, make up your invocations. It's a real language. So when the angel squeezed Kelly and extruded this awareness of language out of his DNA, it started a process. Now, about a year after the squeezing experience, a fellow by the name of Count Albert Lasky arrived from Poland, and he explained to Dee and Kelly that if you're using the seal of Amet, well, I happen to know a place where there's a real seal of Amet on the land. And that place was Prague. Now, Prague is surrounded by 7 hills, and in the very center of town, there is a pentagram formed of 5 synagogues. So the very city of Prague is an analog of the seal of truth. Now, this really got Dee's juices going. In addition to Prague was also the capital of Rudolf II, who was very much the Hermetic philosopher king of the time. And so this seemed to be the answer to a lot of situations, both spiritual and political, in the sense that if you were going to start a new Hermetic world, Prague is probably the place in the late 16th century that you'd want to start it. Basically, Dee and Kelly launched on what we'll call an apocalyptic missionary journey. And their apocalyptic missionary work was to convince as many rulers as possible that Christianity was completely defunct and that it was time for a new Hermetic, based on the work of Hermes, worldview. Since Rudolf was already very susceptible to this idea, this was very much what Rudolf believed, they expected they would get a very powerful reception in Prague. And they did. Now, one of the things that Kelly brought along with him when he showed up at Dee's door was a vial of what he thought was the powder of projection, the philosopher's stone material that would turn base metal into gold, and a very ancient manuscript in a language no one could read because it was in code, that we now know of as the Voynich manuscript. Now, Dee, of course, was fascinated with both, and they decided that this was the best way to get close to the emperor is to offer him these presents. And, of course, Rudolph, loving anything that was occult and mysterious and strange, just thought this was wonderful. So that's how the Voynich manuscript ended up with Rudolph II. Now, I should perhaps talk a little bit about Dee's diaries. Dee was Queen Elizabeth's chief intelligencer. He wasn't like Burleigh, the person who ran spies. He was the person who took the information from all the spies and made sense of it. He was sort of the head analyst, if you want to think of it that way. So Dee kept a private diary, quote, quote, private diary, that was meant to be left laying around so that all the spies could read it and get the wrong impression about who was visiting and where they were going and what they were working on. And he kept a private, really private, working diary of all the magic stuff that was hidden for 60 or 70 years after his death, which would indicate that Dee didn't intend anyone to see that diary. So it's often a bit of a balancing act to try to figure out from the public private diary what's true and valid and what was a hoax, and comparing it to the truly private diary in which Dee kept meticulous records of everything they did. Now, in looking through the private diary, we discover a series of names, and those names are all around the idea of the brothers Garland, or brothers of the Garland. And there are 4 names that have Garland attached. And in searching through the entire record of the Elizabethan era, there is not a single record of any of these Garlands buying anything, selling anything, being paid anything, having any connection to the crown. It's as if they don't exist outside of Dee's diaries and some associated material that we find in the archives of Denmark related to Tycho Brahe. But those names are coherent. They're the same group of names. And one of those names is Edward Garland, which John Dee quickly stops calling him Edward Garland and gives him his real name, Edward Dyer. And Edward Garland, Edward Dyer's friend, brother, etc., was Francis Garland. And again, there is absolutely no record outside of Dee's diary and a few associated documents in Denmark of anyone named Francis Garland. We can trace a John Garland who was somewhat well known, entirely different person. But Francis Garland apparently does not exist outside of Dee's realm of influence. Now this started a train of thought. Who are these mysterious Garlands? Since obviously they were code names because Edward Garland very quickly became Edward Dyer and Francis Garland was his secretary, then we started looking for who might really be, what would the real name of this Francis Garland be? Well, very early on we stumbled onto an unattributed portrait of a 24-year-old in 1588, same age as Shakespeare would have been, that looked like a very young and skinny Shakespeare. I don't have a picture of this because I haven't got permission yet to use it from its owners. But in that particular period, to show your spy master who the real spies were and who was working for whom, portraits would be painted very similar to the marriage portraits that would be very realistic, quickly done so you could make many copies, but would really show what the person looked like. So we speculated that this unattributed but very similar to a young Shakespeare with the right age was Francis Garland. So as we began to look for Francis Garland and didn't find him, we began to cross-reference Shakespeare. And guess what? Every time we have Francis Garland showing up with Dee, there's no record of Shakespeare. In the entire 10 years that Francis Garland appears in Dee's diary, there is not a single incident of Shakespeare being, knowledgeably attributed to be in one place when Garland is in another. And so the idea began to grow that maybe Francis Garland was Shakespeare. Now, this is fascinating.